Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our seminar, Meeting Water Yield Challenges in Northeast Victoria. It's a pleasure to have the range of people joining us, so thank you very much. Before we start today, we would like to acknowledge that this event and our participants are located on the lands of many traditional custodians in Australia. We recognise their ongoing connection to the land and value their unique contribution to water management and to Australian society. We pay our respects to Indigenous elders, past, present and emerging, and extend this respect to any Indigenous participants joining us online today. And I think given that this event is being held in NAIDOC Week, it is wonderful to welcome Jason King to today's presentation, very timely, so thank you. I just would like to acknowledge the River Basin Management Society, La Trobe University, Northeast Catchment Management Authority, who are sponsoring these series of 3 seminars with support from the Australian government through the National Landcare Program. So we have 2 great speakers today. First up is Dr. Alison King, Principal Research Fellow at the Centre of Freshwater Ecosystems at La Trobe University. And our second speaker, as mentioned, will be Jason King, Principal Aboriginal Advisor at the Victorian Department of Jobs, Precincts and Regions. To start our session today, Alison will present for 20 minutes, followed by Jason's presentation. Once we've heard from Jason, we will turn to a Q&A to answer questions coming in live from you, our audience. You can submit your questions at any time during today's presentation through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can do this at any time. However, be aware we only have 15 minutes at the end of today's session to answer questions, so we might not get through them all. However, the questions will be recorded for inclusion in further discussions and planning around this topic, so your questions won't be lost. This webinar will be recorded and emailed to everyone who registered, so if you miss something, you'll be able to catch up. Just another note too of housekeeping, due to some technical issues, our slides are being controlled remotely and not by our speakers. So you might notice there's a little bit of a lag. We apologise for this, but just ask for your understanding and patience. I'm sure after the 6 or 7 months that we've all had working from home through various guises that we're well versed in these challenges, and we have an increased level of understanding of that. So once again, thank you very much for making the time to join us. I hope you find the 2 sessions today really stimulating and interesting and very relevant for us in this wonderful catchment as we think about the challenges into the future. So without further ado, I welcome Dr. Alison King to the virtual lectern. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. And yeah, quite a strange experience doing the virtual lectern, but I'm hoping that we can get through it all today. So I'm going to talk today about the ecological consequences of changed water patterns in the Northeast. And I just wanted to emphasise that I'm actually based here in Albury-Wodonga, so I'm actually on the Albury side at the moment, but well and truly in the Northeast, and I call this place my home as well. So next slide, please. Sorry, I'm just going to have to get used to saying next slide as well. Next. So just to briefly recap on the problem and recap on what we heard a couple of weeks ago now. So we know that we're in a world of changing climate and that will affect our river flows. We've been told about that this region is going to have an annual average temperature that's going to be increasing over a long period of time. We're going to see longer summers with more extreme days. And in terms of rainfall, we're going to see that annual average rainfall really declining. We're going to see longer dry periods, but importantly, we're going to see more variable years. So not as many wet years as the dry years. And we're also going to see more storm events. And this has implications for water yields for in our Northeast Victorian catchments, with up to 40% less water being predicted in some of our catchments in coming decades. And we're actually seeing evidence of this now. So stream flows since 1997, stream flow volumes have actually declined in the Kiewa and Ovens by up to 45%. So this indicates that these problems are real and we're seeing them now. Next slide. So if you're like me, you're starting to think about, well, all these changes in hydrology or the patterns in temperature and rainfall, what will this actually mean for our aquatic ecosystems? And in particular, the species that live within them and the humans which rely on them. So can we predict what might occur in these sorts of systems? And importantly, can we do anything to help? And so that's what I'm going to sort of step through some of the knowledge about that today, and also some of the ideas about what what we can do. Next slide. So firstly, just to start with some real definitional sort of things, and I apologize if I'm preaching to the converted, but I really just want to make sure that everybody knows there's some of the basic terms that we're talking about. So firstly, what I've got here is a hydrograph of a 20-year period on the bottom left-hand side of the slide of the Lower Ovens River. And then I've matched that with a typical river floodplain cross-section, just to show you what that sort of means. So the first component in here is the low flows. So I'm talking about the base flow conditions and also the cease to flow conditions, so when there's no water in the system at all. So those low flow conditions can be quite long, but in actual fact, in our region, we see seasonal low flow periods every year. They're an annual occurrence, and we often see them in summer and autumn. The freshers, which is the next band on top of that, is those events that occur between the low flows to the upper bank, and those can occur all year round. And finally, the floods, which are the ones that are really big and impressive, that go out onto the floodplains and connect up all of the connections between the wetlands and the floodplain itself. And they're most common in this region in the winter and spring period. Next slide, please. So whilst I'm talking about flow events, and next slide, sorry. As I'm talking about flow events, it's important when we're thinking about ecology to actually thinking about that the responses, how things are going to respond, are actually governed by the temporal sequence or the time sequence of those flows. So we can talk about those in terms of three aspects. So the first of those is a flow event. So think about that as a low flow period or a flood event. And so it might be the timing of that event or the magnitude or the duration of that event. We can secondly think about it as a flow history. So for example, a biotic response of a flood might be quite different if it's occurring after a really long low flow period, as it would be if it was occurring after a regular sequence of floods. And finally, the third is a flow regime. So when we're seeing long-term cycles of floods and droughts. So the changes that we're seeing now and that we're likely to see due to these changed drying conditions will be dependent upon these kind of components. And that's the sort of the structure that I'll work through in the talk today. Next slide. So firstly, low flow periods as an event are an important feature and a natural feature of aquatic systems. We know that, we see that each year, as I mentioned, particularly in this region. Rob Rolls and colleagues in 2010 actually characterised the importance of these low flows into 4 principles and described that they ultimately influence the composition, the breeding, the abundance, and even the distribution of the biota within them based on those 4 principles. Next slide. So the first of those is the extent of the physical habitat. So that's quite simply how much water. You get more things living in it if you have more water available. So low flow periods will reduce the volume, the area, and the depth of the habitats, whether that be riffles, runs, and pools. So aside from the physical extent or how much water is actually there, as those low flows contract, you're going to have increased competition and predation and reduced food sources for those species. So the outcome might depend on the species' habitat preferences and also the local features in that particular area. And so the species abundance and persistence might be quite different between the species and between different areas, depending on short and long-term outcomes. Next slide. So we also know through work that was done a few years ago that low flows, natural low flows, are really important breeding areas or breeding times and recruitment periods for many native fish species. So in particular in this region, small-bodied species use slack water habitats or areas with low velocities or low flow velocities where they have increased food and warm temperatures and can shelter from predators. So we know that these are important periods. Next slide. But we know that particularly when low flow periods occur over a longer period of time, that those low flow periods can end up with water quality deteriorating. So we can have dissolved oxygen declines, temperature increases and nutrient increases, and that sensitive biota are most likely to be severely affected. And examples of those are some macroinvertebrate species and some fish. Now, the best examples have actually occurred probably in the last few years, say in the lower Darling River, where we saw massive fish kill events due to poor water quality conditions that occurred during those lower flow periods. But we also see these sort of lower flow events or low and poor deterioration of water quality occurring within wetlands and pools in intermittent streams quite regularly. And so they're more localized events. Next slide. The third principle is around food webs and the transport of energy. So low flows will actually reduce the transport of energy within the system, both longitudinally, so downstream through a catchment, and also laterally between the riparian and the floodplain to the channel itself. So it increases the retention, so how long it stays in a particular point, of organic matter such as leaves and carbon, sticks and so forth in stream and also out on the floodplain. So it reduces that amount of energy which can be broken down and can be inputted into the system. And it can lead to altered macroinvertebrate communities. Next slide. And finally, the last principle in terms of low flows as an event is restricted connectivity. Now, these pictures on the right-hand side aren't from Northeast Victoria, they're actually from Europe, but I think it's a really good sequence to show you. So the top two demonstrate a ephemeral river with flows occurring quite strongly. And so you've got this longitudinal connectivity where species can be moving up and down. The second two show restricted connectivity where there's little or no surface connectivity and the water is actually contracted into refugia or isolated pools. And thirdly, the bottom two photos demonstrate what happens when there's no surface water. So it's completely dried and that refugia are actually completely gone. So this demonstrates this sort of cycles of expansion and contraction, these natural cycles that really alternate periods of flowing and dry patches. And normally these would happen quite regularly in systems. And it's important to note that even when the surface water, what we can see as humans, often is limited on the top of the channel, the hyperrheic or the groundwater actually can persist underneath and some biota can occur underneath that. So it's important to maintain populations of, surface water taxa such as fish. We want to be able to maximize the conditions when it is flowing to enable those patches to connect up and allow movement between. And so the configuration of those refugia, where they are spatially within the catchment, is absolutely critical. And also protecting those refugia from other threats in the catchment is really critical as well to maintain those into the future. Next slide. So whilst we've talked about low flows as an event, we also know that they can become really quite long, extended low flow periods or droughts. And so droughts can be thought of as a ramp disturbance event where they're increasing in severity and spatial extent over time. Indeed, many of our rivers can change from flowing environments into lentic environments or non-flowing environments. And these are quite extreme environments for for biota to be able to survive. Now, species that survive droughts and quite extreme droughts tend to have what we call adaptive traits of resistance or resilience. So we could think of that in terms of that they might have broad thermal or water quality tolerances, or they might even have resistant life stages such as some zooplankton and seeds, for instance, that can stay in the sediments and then hatch out when the conditions are at better times. But we've got some examples of what occurs during these longer drought periods. Next slide, please. So I'll just take you through a couple of examples of what occurred during the Millennium Drought. We saw that there was increased mortality of river red gums throughout the Murray catchment, and in particular in terms of them being in poor condition. We also saw declines of a number of small bodied vulnerable fish species, particularly in the lower Murray region, and localised extinctions of Yarra pygmy perch here. Next slide. We also saw in the Murray River closer to home up here around Yarrawonga, Bruce Chessman recorded some substantial declines in the catches and recruitment of 2 out of 3 Murray River turtle species. So that was the long neck and the short neck turtles, with declines occurring from pre-drought to after drought conditions. Next slide. Jim Thompson and colleagues looked at what occurred during the whole period of those declining flow times. So that's the upper graph here on the right-hand side, and also that increasing temperature, which is the next graph, across the whole of Victoria. And they looked at what the impact would be on macroinvertebrates, which is the final graph here. And they found that there'd be substantial, sorry, I'll say that again. They found that there were substantial declines in more sensitive taxa and increases in tolerant taxa. But what was really interesting, I think, out of this study was that they found that streams with increased vegetation and riparian cover were in much better condition than in other systems. And so that really indicates or shows potentially a way to increase the resilience to drought periods is by maintaining vegetation and riparian cover. Next slide, please. We also know that another thing that can happen with long-term droughts, and in this case I've shown a hydrograph of a 10-year period in the yellow there at Tocumwal of a low flow period that was then interrupted by drought-breaking rains, if you like, that occurred in 2010. And I apologise, the red arrow's gone a little bit adrift there, but you get the idea. So those floods, when they can occur in these really heavy flood periods after a long period of low flows, can inundate previously dry floodplains that have that high carbon load, all of that leaf litter material that hasn't been able to be moved and utilised. It pushes back into the system in a really big way and can create increased risks of hypoxic or low dissolved oxygen black water events, and can lead to fish kills and crayfish kills. Next slide. And in 2010, I was unfortunate, or fortunate in some ways, to witness an event like this that occurred at, and some of you may remember, that occurred at Barmah Forest, and then occurred for about 2,000 kilometres of river kilometres downstream of the forest, where we ended up with large mortality of large-bodied fish species. We had Murray crayfish, which were crawling out of the water up onto the banks, and eventually most of them died, and also large deaths of shrimp. Now that a change in abundance of fish at least lasted both in the short term, so immediately in terms of months, but also in the medium term for a couple of years. But eventually the system did recover. Next slide. Of course, we're also seeing a recent change of post-drought impacts when we're thinking about fires. So we're seeing in recent times when the fires have come through, we're also getting sediment slugs, which include low dissolved oxygen, and the immediate impacts are occurring here similarly to Blackwater, with deaths of fish and other biota, and potentially other long-term impacts. But we know from previous studies that there is some evidence that recovery can occur. Next slide. That recovery can occur, and this example is from the Ovens Valley in after bushfire in the early 2003, where Jared Lyon and colleagues looked at the effect of pre-fire, which is in the top panel, and then compared that immediately afterwards at 1 month compared to 3 years. And whilst there was immediate effects in the local area and they were quite severe, the fish populations did recover after 3 years. And so hopefully this is what's going to occur within our catchments at the moment, but the scale of what we recently saw is quite different. So we'll have to wait and see on that. Next slide. But we know that longer term, the climate is drying at a much more, if you like, pervasive, longer term influence. And so we are seeing long-term projections of stream flow declines over many of our systems. So it would be quite interesting if we can actually predict what sorts of changes might occur to our aquatic biota and at this sort of scale. Now, we're quite limited in what we can do ecologically in terms of predictions, but some of us have actually had a go at this. So next slide. So Nick Bond and colleagues actually have done what's called species distribution modelling and matched that to climate change scenarios. And what they've done here is this study was about looking at the climate change scenarios and the impacts on fish distribution, so the occurrence of fish at particular locations throughout Victoria in this case. They've used historical fish distribution data, matched that with climate and hydrology data, and then made those comparisons to and predictions based on the scenarios to come up with scenarios of distributions. Next slide. So those models were able to predict that they were going to have in the future, and I've just focused in on the medium climate change scenario here, their outputs. And the left-hand side of this figure shows all of the species that they've looked at. What they showed is that there'd be some species that would have substantial range contractions, and two of those would be the river blackfish species, which we see in the northeast, and two species of introduced trout species. But there'd also be range expansions, so species such as golden perch, a native species, and introduced species of weatherloach and gambusia. And to hone in on that a little bit more, just the next slide. If we look at just the river blackfish here, and the top panel shows the historic distributions, and the darker blue lines, I know this is very small, but I just want you to get the impression of what's happening here with the scenarios. The darker blue line shows you the higher occurrence of those species occurring. So historically, compared to the median figure in the middle, you can see that those periods are actually declining, or those locations. And the bottom graph, the red regions, are the areas where there's going to see most change. And so what you can see here is that for river blackfish, that there's going to be loss in some of those northern flowing catchments. And we're actually seeing this play out now for this particular species, with range contractions occurring already. Next slide. Another bit of similar work, but an extension of that, was work that Nick again was involved with a whole range of different colleagues. And again, building on this species distribution modelling approach, they've looked at climate, environment, but also this time matching in the temperature thresholds of fish right across the Murray-Darling Basin. And this figure shows species richness predictions. So the top panel, the top left-hand side panel, shows the present distributions, and then through the various scenarios as it goes in extreme. Excuse me. So what it's predicting is that there'd be severe declines in native fish species richness occurring across the Murray-Darling Basin, and loss of climatically suitable areas. And that in particular, that's going to occur in the northern parts of the basin. But for us in the southern parts, if you focus in on what's going to happen in the southern parts, it seems that we're actually going to be a bit of a climate refuge, where there'll be higher number of species persisting in this region, particularly in the upper Murray, Midder, Goulburn and Campaspe rivers. Now, I really did want to stress, though, that in some ways these scenarios paint a picture of the worst possible outcome. They aren't factoring in any concepts of adaptation or population resilience over what we're currently seeing. But I really think it's important that they're stark reminders of a potential future, and one that we should consider. Next slide. So in summary, low flow events are natural, but we can use what we see natural to start predicting what we might see in a more drying climate in future. And we're definitely going to see more increased risks to our aquatic environment and the biota living within them. Modelling for climate change just on species range does show that there'll be extensive range shifts and localised extinctions in this throughout the Murray-Darling Basin, and particularly in this region as well. But in northeast Victoria, it's going to actually act as a climate refuge, if you like, the Murray-Darling Basin fish arc. And maybe that's a bit of an opportunity for us to consider. And finally, the last slide. In terms of what we can actually do, I think we should be looking to better understand the likely changes, and also manage with these changes and influences in mind, And importantly though, really start to actively mitigate against the other interacting effects to increase the capacity for our species to have resilience against these changes. And with that, I'll leave it there. I think the last slide's just a thank you. Thanks, Katie.
Thanks very much for that, Alison. Some really thought-provoking data there. But also, I think what I really took away from that is there is some hope there. We can see that after some devastating events, that ecosystems have the ability to recover and they have the ability to come back. So I think with all of this, we've got to find those glimmers of hope and build on those as we think and we plan forward. So thanks very much. Like we said, we'll take questions at the end. So keep putting your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And I would like to throw over to Jason. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. So before I start, I need to acknowledge the country that I'm on. That's the traditional custodians of the Wadawurrung people down here in Geelong. For those of you who haven't heard of me, pretty lucky, I reckon, because I'm a bit of a rat bag, but I'm Jason Brian King. I'm born on Gunai country down in a little town called Buchan in East Gippsland. And as I said, I live in Geelong currently. My ancestry comes from my dad's dad. He was a Gunditjmara man down at Portland Lake Conda, and my dad's mum, who was a Nagario woman from the Queanbeyan area down into Victoria, so the Monaro High Plains is home. And on my mum's side, I'm Irish, County Cork, Mannixes, and Scottish from Edinburgh, the Millers and Greys. As I was introduced before, I'm currently the Principal Aboriginal Advisor to the Head of Resources under Rural and Regional Victoria in the Jobs, Precincts and Regions. But before that, I had a life of just on 4 years or 3 years working in water as the manager of the Aboriginal Water Unit. And before that, 10 years working in Aboriginal health as a CEO to Aboriginal Health Services. So that's me in a nutshell. Next. So as you know, today or starting on Sunday was NAIDOC week. Always was, always will be. If you go to the march in Melbourne, you will hear this, but then you'll hear the next piece. Next piece, please. Next slide. Don't tell me it's not going to work. Okay. We may have a bit of a problem, Katie.
I think we might. That's all right.
That's okay. So basically, the next little piece that was going to come up was Aboriginal land. That's what always was, always will be, has come from a chant from the old people. And really, those old people didn't get to see change that's happened throughout Victoria and the country. We have the Native Title Act, we have the Traditional Land Settlement Act as well. But we still don't get access to those key priorities of wanting to become economic leaders within our own communities. So things like silver, gold, mineral sands, coal, oil and gas are excluded from us when we get native title and traditional owner settlement agreements. But one day, perhaps it'll get better for my daughter and her kids. So the biggest thing I was going to talk about is in the area where everyone is from up that way is you've got obviously Yorta Yorta, you have Tunarong, but you also have 4 groups that are not recognised by the state of Victoria currently. And we have currently, there it is. Can we go to the next one, please? So that's the map currently of registered settlement of registered Aboriginal parties for the state of Victoria. You'll note the light green part just near Wodonga there and Benalla up and across the top, and then that big white slave, which is basically across into East Gippsland and Northeast. So if we go to the next. So I've hazarded a guess that this is the catchment area. And if you go to the next one again for me, you have the Jutaroa, Dudarawa, Darugul Aboriginal corporations and the Dudarawa Waivuru nations in that big area that cover that. It's not perfect by any stretch, so please don't hold me to it. And they basically, the Jutaroa, Dataroa groups with Wairuru basically cover the Mitamita, Kiwa rivers across to Talangata, the Murray River Valley down to Jillinick and Tindarara, I can't even say that properly, to Albury. So there's that group. If we go to the next one, please. That little swathe is a part of the Yamathang or Jamathang crew. They were basically Omeo up into the plains, and they were neighbours with Jutaroa. And then the next one, please, is my grandmother's people that come from the Monaro High Plains down into Victoria. Again, this is just a representation of the areas that they cover. The rest of that white area, apart from where Orbost is down in that far left part, is the Bitterwell people. So we basically have traditional owners in those areas whilst they're not recognised. When I was at DELP, we still worked with non-recognised groups. Why? Because in future, if they get recognition or settlement agreements or native title, we need to have that conversation with them about what, where and how they want to work with us. All major DELP offices in Shepparton and a couple of others across the state all have Aboriginal inclusion officers if you ever need any help with finding out who your traditional owners are. Next, please. So values and uses. The last stuff from Alison was fantastic because science gives us what we need. But more importantly, to find out what we actually need is to have a look at the values and uses of people. These three photographs are all from the Wamba Wamba and Barappa project that was done with the North East CMA. They did field visits. They sit down and they have a look at where they wanted water to go to, how they wanted the water to get there. And that fence in the middle was to block off an area, I think, of Old Man Weed in the Gumbower State Forest for when it was flooded to see how the local plants, flora and fauna would grow in that area without having carp or any other predators in that little area. The one on the right is to look at cultural heritage, the biggest part of a registered Aboriginal party's job from day to day. But then I need to go to the next one, please. Then you have the ranch is on the left, which is up in the Wimmera River, which used to be an oxbow of the Wimmera River, and that's the Barinja or the Wodjabolic people. And the one on the right is actually on Lake Condamishn down at Portland, near Portland and Haywood, and that's an actual aquaculture system. The Gunditjmara people, who I'm a part of, and that's meant declared conflict, basically they've seen the Darlets Creek never run dry in 15,000 years of occupation that's been recorded. They actually witnessed Budgenbim erupt and the lava flows in that area. It's the first Aboriginal site that's listed on World Heritage listings for the country, and we're hoping there's going to be plenty more of them. But as you can see with the Billabong, the water's fairly clean there, but also the straightening of the river was done in the 1900s because back then the best science was a straight line is the best way to get a lot of water down a river when it flooded. And that goes back to looking at what are the values and uses? Why would Aboriginal people want to flood an oxbow? Well, that's where they lived, that's where they fished, that's where they hunted. These things are really, really important to us. And each family, clan and tribe want to protect their local country. And to do that, you've got to talk to them about it. If we go back to old science, if you go back, if you look at the way science is looked at from 100 years ago to now, there's big differences. Aboriginal science is between 40, 60, 80,000 years old. Why wouldn't you go back to the people who lived in this country for a long time? These are the most important aspects of looking at it, because we don't look at it through a Western scientific lens. We look at it as the way country needs to be read and reading country. What we did with all the projects that have been on the screen, there's about 15 that have been done over the state of Victoria. We're funded, when I was at DELP, funded Aboriginal water officers. They basically did a values and uses assessment. They did an Aboriginal waterways assessment, which is a hybrid of the Maori Cultural Heritage Index that was created in New Zealand. And we tailored it for us. So we would walk reaches of the river of places that were significant to Aboriginal people. I think to date, there's been 10 Aboriginal waterways assessments completed. I know that Judaroa, Wairau did one in 2014, 2015, before the Aboriginal Water Unit even existed. This was to find out what their values of the water and what use they would use. Nearly all projects that have been done in this little area of Aboriginal water has been done with consultation with the CMAs, but also with the Victorian Environmental Water Holder. No water's been taken off anybody from industry or from anywhere else. We've actually utilised environmental flows and seasonal watering plans to get water into the said billabong. We used water initially through Section 8A rights to get the water for the hobby farm, which you see there with the aquaculture system, a 1-tonne system. It is a hobby because under legislation, we can't take water under a Section 8 for commercial purposes. So these projects have utilised steering committees, they've utilised cultural workshops, traditional ecological knowledge to find out what and where we need to have water. And they've also done knowledge exchanges with other traditional owners in the state to say, how did you go about getting your Aboriginal waterways assessment completed? So the Wadawurrung from Geelong and Ballarat went up to Albury Wodonga to talk with Judaroa. They also went up to speak with Barappa Barappa and Wamba Wamba about their projects. Next slide, please. So these are the things you can do and you should do. Aboriginal employment. Aboriginal water officers are a great starting point, or an Aboriginal liaison officer, but you need to show that you're committed to employing more than just that Aboriginal water officer. The cultural load that sits upon one's shoulders as an Aboriginal man or woman working in a non-Aboriginal agency is huge. I used to work for the Department of Justice, and everything justice related in East Gippsland came to me. You're the expert, go and fix it. I know nothing about justice. I was there as a policy worker and a programs guide. Same thing in health. Everything to do with health was put on my shoulders. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a nurse. I was an administrator of a business, 2 businesses which were worth over $10 million. The second one is cultural awareness. You guys in the Northeast have 5, 6 traditional owner groups. You need to find what you need to know from each of those traditional owners. Not all traditional owners will talk to one another, and that's okay. I'm guessing most farmers and most industries don't talk or collaborate on projects when it comes down to the bare bones of money. So speak to your local Aboriginal communities, but speak to your traditional owners first. It's not hard to find. Use the Office of Registered Indigenous Corporations. It's a government website. So ORIC, oric.gov.au. And if you know the name of the traditional owner group, or even just the state, you can type that in and you can find who you need. So moving on from cultural awareness, you go to targeted works or co-design. When I was at DELP, the co-design was the biggest thing we did. We worked with traditional owners and we made sure we found out what and where they wanted works to happen. This was really, really important. We want you as non-Aboriginal people to ask, but then to listen to what we're looking to do on country. And what may seem illogical or a bit far-fetched to you might be the single most important piece of the puzzle to traditional owners, and may in the long run have broader benefits than you first thought. Then that runs into internal Aboriginal working groups. If you can get those up and running, they're really, really handy. The one at Barappa Wamba at Northeast Central CMA works really, really well. And years and years ago, I'm showing my age, I had the privilege to sit on a community panel, I think of the CMA, the West Gippsland CMA under CEO at the time, Jeff Hocking. And for me, that was a massive eye-opener. I had no idea what CMAs did as a cultural heritage officer, but it gave me a perspective of what the traditional owners down my way, the Gunai Kurnai, wanted. So then I took that into a room and shared that with them on what was going on. Really, really important. Which leads to the next one, and the most important, true partnership. Business or social partnerships are like a marriage that both partners have duties, roles to perform. Not one is more important than the other, but these duties and roles contribute to the whole of whatever partnership you're working on. We as Aboriginal people must be one of the most consulted peoples on the planet, from government to PhD students through to just everyday people just wanting to know what we want. It's mostly all take, and we rarely do we ever hear back from different people. But our knowledge has been viewed under a Western lens, Western science and thinking lens. We're the true experts of our country. We know what we know from our elders and from stories passed down over 60,000 years. We need to look at these without the educational or Western or scientific lens cast over our decisions and needs. We want you to believe in what we believe in. We don't want to take, like when the first time native title was announced and traditional owner settlement agreements, people thought they were going to lose country. It was never about taking things off people. It was about getting our little slot in this country. We know that we can't reverse colonisation. So having said that, for all those in industry and CMAs, just remember CMAs have been around for about 20 years to hone what you currently do. And so have the water experts, just like Dr. King before. She's studied a lot, she knows a lot. But traditional owners have only had 4 years in the water space with BIT funding from DELP. Take your time and enjoy what you do. But then the do not do's. Do not have dependency on funding from current funders. Look outside the box. That's probably one of the most important. The Aboriginal Water Program, under the management now of Kirsty Savage and Bryony Grice, when I first started, that money for us was to go to Aboriginal organisations to get their water needs and wants off the ground. And it's been diluted. And it's hard because if you're getting paid to do a job, which has a similar aspect to it than what the TOs want to do, then how do we get the balance or equilibrium between the two? And that goes back to partnerships and targeted works and co-design. And the very last one that I'll leave you with, do not take the partnership for granted. Do not rush off because you've got a letter of support for the first project to go and get funding from the federal government through environment or agriculture to do X, Y, and Z. Make sure you have traditional owners sitting at the table. If you've got 6 traditional owners currently in your catchment, even if they're not recognised, you need to have them at the table. I cannot emphasise that enough. Everybody has different perspectives on what they want and how they want to do it. You need to talk to them independently, and then if you can, get them in the room together. Work with your Aboriginal inclusion coordinators for your local regions, and work with the Aboriginal Water Program at DELP in water and catchments. So that's it from me, very short and sweet.
Thanks very much for that, Jason. That was a great presentation again, and I think highlights the complexity of this area, but the work that we all need to put in to pick up on the do's and try to avoid the do nots.
Yep.
All right, so thank you for that. We're going to open it up for questions. So if you do have questions, I ask that you put them in the Q&A box at the bottom, and then I'll read them out and take them to the panel. We have had a question just about the availability of these webinars post the event, and they will be available through the La Trobe University YouTube channel, but we'll also make sure that they are linked to from the NECMO website as well, so hopefully you can all find them. I'm going to kick off the questions, and Jason, I'm going to put it to both of you. But Jason, I think you raised a great point there about how we integrate traditional ecological knowledge and put it on the same par and give it the same level of importance as we do Western science. Have you seen examples, and I think too that's even more important when we think about the changes that are happening to our climate and the length of time that those patterns play out. As you mentioned, there's at least 60,000 years of knowledge that we can pull on and those cycles. So can you give us an example of where you think you've seen that Western science and traditional ecological knowledge come together really well and in a true on par? And Alison, you might have seen examples as well, but really keen to hear your thoughts.
So the one for me was when I was a manager of the Aboriginal Water Unit at DELP, was obviously the one I showed, the North Central CMA working with Barappa Wamba on the Gumbau State Forest. They had particular ideas of what plant species they wanted within the state forest. And then they went back, they used biologists, botanists, ecologists, and hydrologists to figure out, can this actually happen? So they actually worked hand in hand, and people like Alison and those got together and said, right, explain to us why this is important. So old man weed is an anti-inflammatory. It's brilliant for arthritis and stuff, and it's used for other pieces as well. But it was just considered, oh, it's just another plant that lives in the local area. Why do we need it? It was giving that extra knowledge across. Alison?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I think there's numerous examples. And I've only recently come back to Northeast Victoria from living in and working in Northern Australia. And probably there's some fantastic examples there's many fantastic examples that I could describe up there. Just one that I was really involved in was a juvenile species of, I'll say it again, a species of fish that we were working on in the Katherine River in Northern Territory with the local people and the Jawoyn people. And they were actually part of our project right from the very start. And they identified a species, the sooty grunter, that they were particularly concerned with. It was a species that they were seeing declined in low water periods. And as scientists, we were saying, well, we could find out a little bit more about them. How about you join in? And so they joined in with the project, and the outcome of it was we've now been able to input into the management of that water system and protect the low flows. That's the summary part. But the really awesome part about it was when we actually had the rangers on site with us, they were saying, well, these fish are going to do different things at nighttime than during the day. We need to look at them at nighttime. And we went, oh, okay, well, we could do that. Let's put nighttime in, and that could be important. And sure enough, they were doing different things at nighttime and during the day. They were using quite different habitats, and that were more of a concern, the riffle habitats at nighttime. And if we hadn't had those traditional owners and those traditional knowledge being given to us, we may have even overlooked that. So that's just a really personal, quite simple example, but it does give you an indication. And Jason, you also gave an example of the Gunditjmara people. I think that's another classic example. And again, Yorta Yorta and Barma Milawa, we're learning how to work with each other and how we can benefit. And if we keep that in mind, that we're learning and we're still making mistakes and still learning how to do it, I think we're getting there. Still got a long way to go, but we're getting there.
Yeah, it's a new space. 4 years for traditional owners to be working in water.
Yeah.
And I know from personal experience internally, I was told you need to get this program up and running and have the same outcomes as CMAs were having. And I went, hang on a minute, you exclude us for 230 years, and then in the space of 3 years, you want me to get us up to a 20-year organisation's level of sophistication. I said, it's not going to happen. They still need to sit down and talk with one another. That's why they have open group meetings as traditional owners to get that information out. What do you want from us as a corporation? How do you want us to involve the doctors from universities and the researchers from CMAs and that sort of thing? This is the stuff that's really hard, because to get people all together, someone like Dja Dja Wurrung has 400-500 members. To get them all in a room to talk and to talk on one topic is very, very hard, especially when you've been told, we don't want to know what your opinion is. And now all of a sudden, every man and his dog wants to come and knock on the door.
Thank you for that. There's been a follow-up question to that around drought, and in particular, are there traditional owner perspectives that can help us deal with drought more effectively in both thinking from a river management perspective and potentially even agricultural adaptation.
Alison?
That's a good throw, Jace. Look, I feel really bad speaking for, or not bad, but I feel out of place speaking about this in some ways. So Jace, please jump in if you think this is incorrect. But I did work with the Yorta Yorta many years ago in Barmah in the middle of the Millennium Drought. And what really came there was that people were talking to us as people who were trying to manage the water at the time a lot about the pain and the feeling of places dying. And I think what came to me at that time, and it feels a little bit, as I said, a little bit wrong for me to speak to, so I apologise. But what came to me at that time is that I think there was an early warning that was being given by the community earlier than, if you like, white managers, if I can say it like that, were perceiving a problem, and perhaps even science that was perceiving changes in the environment. And when we started to listen and think about it and come together more to hear the stories, that was when we tried to think about what we could do. And of course it's limited to what you could do. So I'm not saying that there's solutions there, but I really feel like those voices were really important. And as I said, this is going back to Millennium Drought times. So again, forgive me for using a 10 years plus in time period, but that the story and the ecological connection, I think, is something that's pretty important to incorporate.
Yeah, it is. The gentleman who was the lead in the investigation to the fish kills in the lower Darling and Menindee Lakes, he gave a presentation at DELP. I can't think of his name off the top of my head. He basically said they were given 2 weeks to talk to traditional owners on what they wanted. We're always in government's minds, the last people to speak to about environment. That needs to change. We need to be one of the first. We need to be partnered with CMAs and water corporations. I can't emphasize that enough, because we're always left to the back end of the discussion. Because he said, I would love to have sat down for 3 or 4 months to have this discussion on the lead up to draining Menindee Lakes and working with traditional owners on how we keep the fish alive. But I was given 2 weeks, and that was from the MDBA. So yeah, it made it difficult, to say the least, for traditional owners.
So Jason, just picking up, and I think you mentioned this during the presentation, because I'm sure a lot of people are going to go away from this thinking, okay, well, I'm a scientist. How do I'm really interested in understanding how I better engage, or I start to think about traditional ecological knowledge in the work that I'm doing. So from your experience, what's the most practical and useful way for someone in that position to reach out and make contact, and what are those appropriate contact points from your perspective? Yeah,
so I did look I was cheeky and checked the participants register before, and I see there's someone from Tunnerong here. I think Alejandro's on the line. He's the Aboriginal Water Officer for Tunnerong. He would be your contact for them. But more broadly, there's the Federation of Victorian Traditional Owner Corporations based in Melbourne with Paul Payton as CEO. They're only a small organisation, but they represent just over half of the total registered traditional owner parties in Victoria. Go and speak to them about it, because the biggest issue we've had, like I said in my presentation, everyone wants to talk to us. We're over-consulted, information is taken away, and then it's presented as somebody else's own work. It's taking our intellectual property. That's the biggest issue we have currently, is that everybody else is not Aboriginal is being recognised for this really great work, and then Aboriginal people are left to the outer when it comes to, well, actually, that's oh no, I published it, that's mine. So these are the things we've got to work on. Contact your local group, see if you can go and talk to them about, and this is going to sound silly because I know there's a lot of businesses, is the pro bono work to do a project with them to help them get through this. Because the more information and the more statistical information and the more evidence they have, governments love evidence, they will fund projects for the traditional owners moving forward. And I think research groups like La Trobe and stuff, without evidence, you don't get your funding.
Great. Thanks, and some practical advice there that people can follow up on. That's great. Alison, we've got a question here, which I'll throw to you. So what does climate change mean for Murray cod, and probably say even more specifically Murray cod in our region, being selfish? Your thoughts?
Yeah, I can't remember, Nick will hate me, but I can't remember exactly where Murray cod came in his little diagrams in there. I could try to find it, but so there's a few things that I can relate to that. In terms of the species range predictions that they had, I'm pretty sure they were ones that weren't going to be seeing massive changes in species range. They're pretty tolerant in some ways, but some of their other aspects, particularly as we saw in terms of water quality tolerances, they're not particularly tolerant to low dissolved oxygen. We've seen that, and particularly the large bodied, when they get really big, the adults. So we're likely to see changes, definitely. I personally think, and this hasn't been modelled, this is my opinion only, is that we're probably going to see reduced numbers because of just the amount of biomass that in the systems won't be able to sustain those big numbers anymore. And also potentially some changes in things like the breeding and the spawning times and growth rates as well during those, because the conditions are going to warm up. So yeah, in terms of the northeast, I think that we're going to have areas where they'll contract too, like we were talking about before. They're really strongholds. They won't be moving up into, sort of spreading out as much.
Thank you for that. And I've got a follow-on question for both of you, which I guess is taking that to the bigger level, but practical recommendations for increasing the resilience of our rivers in the northeast to drought and climate change.
Yeah, I can start if you like, Jace. I think that was kind of where I was trying to go at the end, was not to leave on, all the doom and gloom, because I think we can get overcome by that in some ways. And whilst it'd be great to be able to control climate change in the future, and we should do our bit, there's only so much that we can do. But locally, I think there are things that we can do. And that last slide, things like, as simple as it sounds, like protecting and identifying where those refuge habitats are going to be in the catchments, and the simple things about knowing where they are and making sure we're not taking water directly out of those, that we've got actually other places that we can get water for cattle in the system, and we're not directly taking them from those water refuges for fish and other biota. But there's other things like, and I know that the CMA is actively doing things like restoring the riparian vegetation to make sure that we've got, and keeping cattle out of those areas and making sure that riparian veg is being maintained as far as we can. Some of those things may seem quite simple, but we've got evidence now that they do make a difference. So yeah, they definitely things that I think we should be concentrating on and using those. And I guess, as I said, being a little bit thought-provoking and pushing, if we're going to be the Murray-Darling Basin fish ark in the future in Northeast, we've probably got an obligation to be looking at this a lot more seriously than just protecting our own patch. We're actually protecting for a much greater area.
I agree and concur. The biggest thing traditional owners say is to get rid of cows, sheep and all that off waterways and stuff. The biggest issue we've had with Beringia-Gadgin, especially with Wodgabolic, is Lake Albocatcher has not had water in it for 23 years, and scientists keep changing the rules on what a major flood event is, from 17 years to 23 years. The next one I think is being blown out to 30 years. That holds something like 250,000 gigalitres of water, and it's 7 metres in depth in some areas. It's not the same water in 17 years, yet farmers were allowed to let cattle roam around it. It's got heritage values along the shores of it, but it's also a Ramsar listed website. So how does that work? So the traditional owners have removed the animals. It'll never get, honestly, I don't think it'll get water in it again, because Lake Hindmarsh will need to overflow again. And I don't think that'll ever happen, especially with the limited flows just shown from the northeast down over in the west. I don't think you'll ever get that lake back to what it will be.
Thank you for that. Just noting the time, so we are going to wind up and leave it for questions from that. I would just like to thank you both, Alison and Jason, for your time and for sharing your knowledge and your expertise today. I think you've highlighted not only the complexities of the changes that are occurring and are going to occur with respect to water, but also opens up opportunities around how we can better bring together a range of information and knowledge, and then really importantly, the traditional ecological knowledge in working together and identifying what we can do to improve the resilience of our waterways and flora and fauna that are associated with them into the future. So thank you very much. It was a great presentation. Thank you to those of you who participated with questions. We hope that we've done our best to answer as many of those that we can. You'll be able to view the webinar if you missed something, and we hope that you have enjoyed and got a lot out of this, and we hope to see you for our third and final wrap up webinar as well. So thank you everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie.
Thank you.